Today's Friday Forum is made possible by Bank of the Cascades, CenturyLink, Family Care Health Plan, Miller Nash, The Standard, and Stoll Reeves.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and welcome to City Club of Portland Friday Forum. I'm John Horvick, City Club President, and I'd like to welcome members and guests alike. Those of you who join us today at the Sentinel Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. Today we are pleased to welcome Nan Roman, President and CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, to discuss whether ending homelessness is a pipe dream or a possibility. But first, some announcements. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Bank of the Cascades, CenturyLink, Family Care Health Plans, Miller Nash, The Standard, and Stoll Reeves. Having Nan Roman here today was made possible with the support of the Citizens Crime Commission, Street Roots, and the Oregon Opportunity Network. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. We launch our annual membership drive next week. With discounts, free lunches, and special prizes, there is no better time to become a member of City Club than during this membership drive. So if you're not yet a member, now is the time to do it. At next week's forum, Craig Vessel, publisher of the Portland Business Journal, will moderate a discussion about the state of the regional economy. And on Thursday, April 10th, City Club's member-led Forum Committee on Government and Public Policy will continue the conversation about Oregon's initiative review process and hear from committee members who are involved in that effort. You can learn more about these and other club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. Join City Club in live tweeting today's event. You can follow or mention us at PDX City Club, and be sure to follow the conversation using the hashtag CityClub and MyHomePDX in your own tweets. As always, we'll be having a Q&A session with our speaker at the end of today's program. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your question. And for all our audience participants, please locate the index cards on the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. We'll collect them prior to the start of the Q&A. And now to our program. More than half of those recently counted as homeless in Multnomah County suffer from one or more serious physical, mental, or addiction-related condition. Given changes underway to federal and state health care programs, City Club has launched a research study to focus on how to improve access to health care services for those experiencing homelessness. Look for that report and recommendations in early 2015. And in the meantime, follow the committee's work by liking City Club of Portland on Facebook and following us on Twitter. The research committee is also in the audience today. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge them and thank you for your commitment to this issue and service to the club. Nan Roman is President and CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. The Alliance is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization whose sole mission is preventing and ending homelessness. Under Ms. Roman's direction, the Alliance seeks to achieve its mission by educating opinion leaders and policymakers through research and capacity building. It works with over 10,000 partner organizations and agencies across the nation. Today, she will discuss what is known about the causes and conditions of homelessness. She will examine emerging evidence-based solutions and the impact they have on the communities that adopt them. Finally, she will consider whether there is adequate knowledge, capacity, and public and political will to end homelessness in our cities and in the nation once and for all. And so without further ado, please help me welcome Nan Roman to the stage.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to join you here in Portland today. And thank you to the City Club. Several years ago, I met a man who I'll call David in the District of Columbia, where I live. He was disabled. He was in recovery from substance abuse disorders, and he had been diagnosed with bipolar disease and manic depression. He had gotten out of federal prison, and he went to a corrections halfway house for 6 months, got a job, and then moved to an Oxford house, which is a program of shared houses for people in recovery. I understand you have them here, because someone mentioned it to me yesterday. There was a layoff at his job, though, and as the last person hired, he was the first person fired, and he had to leave the Oxford house because he couldn't pay the rent. He became homeless. He lived on the street for a while, and then he went to a large shelter, CCNV. You may have heard of that shelter, was the one that was founded by Mitch Snyder in the District of Columbia. He stayed in that shelter for the maximum allowable time, 6 months, after which he had to leave. He then moved to a bench on the corner of 7th and Pennsylvania Avenue. You've seen this corner, I think, because it's on the parade route that the president takes after the inauguration when he walks from the Capitol to the White House. It's also, coincidentally, just a few blocks up the street from HUD, which is also on 7th Street. That bench and a black satchel, big black satchel, were David's home. While he was there, he was hospitalized twice for a total of 11 days. In both cases, he was suicidal. He also spent a lot of time sitting in the emergency room waiting area of hospitals and on buses and subways to get out of the elements. He was considerably bothered by his inability to bathe and keep his clothes clean, very dapper fellow. Because he's disabled, David was receiving income assistance, which at around $220 per month couldn't pay for any housing. He applied for federal housing assistance. There are 60,000 people on the waiting list for housing assistance in the District of Columbia. After being homeless for a year and a half, David decided that the only thing left for him to do was to reoffend and to return to prison, because at least there he could get a bed, a roof, meals, and a regular shower. It was at that point that his mental health caseworker sent him to a Housing First permanent supportive housing program called Pathways to Housing. It gets homeless people very quickly into subsidized scattered site apartments without a lot of behavioral preconditions, and it provides them with services. The services, though, are not mandatory. But the program has such sophisticated and consumer-oriented services that the tenants really love the services and they actively participate with them. Within a week, David had chosen an apartment among several available in several neighborhoods. He moved in. Actually, it's quite near where I live in the district. He had an incredibly and has incredibly supportive services team, and he was stable and happy and looking for a job. It cost taxpayers at least $44,000 for David to be homeless and live on the street. He was on parole and a client of mental health systems, a cost of 2 unconnected case managers, $20,000. He spent 11 days in psychiatric hospitalization, the cost of that $15,400. He spent 6 months at the shelter, the cost of that $9,000. And it could have been worse. He could have been placed in a psychiatric group home, the cost of that $60,000 a year, not including treatment. He could have been hospitalized at our mental health hospital, the cost of that $180,000 a year. He could have been reincarcerated as he planned, the cost of that $65,000 a year. The cost of his supportive housing and services, the only option in which he was not either homeless or institutionalized, $20,000 a year. So the point of this story, in the 30 years that there's been widespread homelessness in our nation, we have learned a lot about how to solve the problem. How to solve it in ways that are much better for homeless people, how to solve it in ways that are much better for our community, and how to solve it in ways that are cost effective. Now, not everyone who is homeless is like David. In fact, the majority of people who become homeless do not share his characteristics. Homelessness is a complicated problem. There are various subpopulations and there are various solutions. But the important thing to know is that we do now know how to solve it. And we didn't always. I want to discuss with you today what we've learned in the past 20-some years about homelessness and its causes and nature, and importantly, more importantly really, what we have learned about how to solve it, because I believe that we can solve it and that we will solve it, not just because homelessness is wrong, but because it also makes sense to solve it for a lot of very practical reasons. So what do we know about the size and nature of homelessness today? Nationally, there are about 610,000 homeless people on a given night. 1.5 million people experience homelessness in the course of a year. About 65% of these people are individuals living on their own, and about 35% are people living in families. The vast majority, I'm going to only be speaking about the national statistics and models because that's not about the Portland situation. The vast majority of people are homeless for economic reasons, but about 20% of people who become homeless have more serious disabilities, which additionally impede their ability to exit homelessness. About 109,000 people are chronically homeless, homeless for long periods of time and disabled. 58,000 people who are homeless are military veterans. 35% of people who are homeless are unsheltered. 35% unsheltered. Homelessness is a housing-driven problem. If people are housed, notwithstanding any other problems that they may have, and not saying that they don't need services, but if they're housed, they are not homeless. Ending homelessness is about getting people housed. It's not about solving every problem that they have. If there were a sufficient supply of affordable housing, there would not be widespread homelessness. And I can tell you this for a fact because I am old enough to remember a time when there was a sufficient supply of affordable housing for low-income people and there wasn't widespread homelessness. That was in the 70s. In the 70s, when I first started working, there were more affordable housing units than there were poor households that needed them. Today, we are 7 million units short of having enough affordable housing units for people who need them. There's 7 million more households who need them than there are units, and this basically explains why we have widespread homelessness now and we didn't have it then, because we didn't. Because there is not enough affordable housing, many poor people are unstable in the housing that they have, and they're at risk of or they become homeless. So let's delve into that a little bit more deeply. What does poor mean? For a single person living on their own, that means they have an income of less than $12,000 a year nationally. For a family of 4, that would be $24,000 a year. 50 million people fall into that category, living in poverty. 16 million people live in deep poverty, which means they have half or less than those income levels. So suppose you are one of the families of 4 that's living in deep poverty here in Portland. Your income is around $12,000 a year, $1,000 a month. You're, in Portland, according to HUD, the typical rent on a low-cost 2-bedroom apartment is $922 a month. I would guess that most of people here would be paying quite a bit more than that. But $922 for fair market rent for a 2-bedroom. That would leave you $78 each month to pay for food, transportation, clothing, health care, school supplies, everything else that you need for you and your kids. $78 a month, $20 a week after you paid the rent. If you're single and living in deep poverty, you'd have $500 a month to spend on everything you need, and a modest studio apartment would cost $666 a month, so more than your income. Even your higher than normal minimum wage here in Oregon wouldn't get you out of the hot water on this. Working 40 hours a week at minimum wage is not enough to afford a studio apartment. If you spend the recommended 30% of your income on housing, you'd have to make $13 an hour or work 56 hours a week to afford a studio apartment. So the point of all of this is that people who are poor pay way too much of their incomes for housing. Now, you might think that people at such low income would get a government subsidy of some sort to help them afford their housing, but you would usually be wrong. Unlike the subsidy that those of us who are homeowners are entitled to through the mortgage interest and property tax deductions, housing assistance for poor people is not an entitlement. Only a quarter of those who are eligible by income for low-income housing subsidy receive it because there's not enough money to provide it to everyone. The result of this is that 2/3 of poor households pay more than half of their income for rent. And that means that any interruption in income can threaten your housing stability, your home, and even can result in homelessness. I recently met a grandmother. Her daughter had 2 kids, and her daughter lived in public housing. But the daughter had a drug problem, and she ended up in jail. So the grandmother moved into the apartment to take care of the children so that the children wouldn't end up in foster care. The little boy had a birthday, and the grandmother wanted to make that special for him. So she spent $60. She splurged and spent $60 on his birthday. That was great. But as a result, when it came time to pay the rent, she didn't have enough in the account to write the check, so she didn't write the check. And when the housing authority didn't get the rent, it followed up and it found out that she was not the primary tenant in the unit. The mother who was in jail was the primary tenant, and began eviction proceedings. So for the price of a birthday present and a cake, we have a costly administrative eviction procedure, possible placement of 2 kids in foster care, and a grandmother who's homeless. I'm happy to tell you that that particular case was sorted out, but the point is that when you're living on the edge with respect to income, you're very vulnerable. And many people who are poor are susceptible to housing crises like this, very serious ones that are brought about by a poor decision, however minor that may be. Not that the rest of us haven't all made poor decisions like this in our lives, or even a little bit of bad luck. People like this grandmother who become homeless for economic reasons do not look different in terms of characteristics from other poor people who are housed. There's nothing that distinguishes homeless people from poor people generally. They don't have more children, they don't have lower education levels, they don't have more mental illness or substance abuse issues. They're just poor people who have a housing crisis. And when they do become homeless, if they do, they don't stay homeless long, and they generally don't ever become homeless again. So that's about 80% nationally of people who experience homelessness look like that. The 20% of people who have disabilities and stay homeless longer obviously present a very different picture. We call that usually chronic homelessness. People who are chronically homeless or living on the streets face, not surprisingly, tremendous challenges. People experiencing chronic homelessness age faster and they die earlier. Their mortality rate is considerably higher than that of the general population, possibly over 3 times higher. Why? Because they are at high risk of sexual and physical violence. Their health deteriorates. Obviously, they suffer the effects of being outdoors, of frostbite, circulatory issues, complications from exposure. They have untreated illnesses like diabetes and heart conditions, and of course, they often suffer from untreated mental illness and substance abuse disorders. These untreated illnesses are bad for them, obviously, and they are costly to us. People who are chronically homeless may use ambulances, emergency rooms, and other acute care health systems and use them frequently. They are also often disproportionately involved with the criminal justice system, not because they're robbing the bank, but generally because they have to live out their lives more or less in public, doing things that the rest of us are able to do in private but are not allowed in public. The combination of shelter, healthcare, and corrections involvement can be very expensive, far more expensive than housing and services would be. Chronic homelessness can cost the taxpayers a lot of money. So chronic homelessness is a crisis. It's a crisis we're compelled to address for economic reasons, for social reasons, for justice reasons, and for human reasons. So that's chronic homelessness and economic homelessness, two kind of cuts on the numbers. There are two other groups of homeless people I want to mention more briefly. The first is unaccompanied homeless youth. That is youth under age 24 who are homeless on their own without any adult. We've counted about 40,000 such youth between the ages of 18 and 24, mostly living in the adult shelter system or unsheltered, and 6,000 unaccompanied youth under 18. But we're confident that actually that these numbers are undercount, so we believe there are more than that. It's also important to note that as many as a quarter of all homeless families are headed by an adult parent who is 24 or under. So that's also a homeless youth problem. And also that foster care, youth exiting foster care disproportionately become homeless. Youth homelessness is different from adult homelessness because of the developmental and family issues associated with it. And it's also less housing driven, although of course youth do need housing too. The other population I want to mention briefly is veterans who are experiencing homelessness. As I said, there are 58,000 veterans experiencing homelessness at a point in time as of last year. That's just over 12% of all homeless adults. Portland, I think, had about 400 homeless vets in 2013. I don't know what the number is for this year. 60% of veterans nationally are sheltered, but 40% of homeless veterans are not sheltered, even sheltered. 8% of homeless veterans are women. That's a growing group. Veterans who are homeless tend to be disproportionately disabled compared to the other homeless population, and veterans are at higher risk of homelessness than either the general population or the poor population. Having said that, the problems that veterans face are not fundamentally different from those of other homeless people. What is different is that there is a different set of resources available to help them through the Department of Veterans Affairs. So these are some of the basic groups, or one way you can divide the populations of homeless people. Economically homeless people, about 80%. Long-term, people who are homeless long-term and with disabilities, about 20%, and then also youth and veterans. So just looking at those main two groups, the economically homeless and chronically homeless, or people with disabilities, what do we do for them now, and what have we learned about what we should do to end their homelessness? Well, starting with the economic group, when homelessness first emerged in the 80s, the response really was to build shelters. But soon, a longer-term, more service-rich model emerged that we called transitional housing. And the transitional housing model is that individuals and families spend 2 years receiving services in a controlled residential facility and then are ready to move back into housing. But there have been a lot of problems with this transitional housing model. It doesn't really address the fundamental issue of economically homeless people who are basically just poor and having an economic crisis. It doesn't really help them with their housing problems per se. The services we find are not as effective for people when they're not living in a stable housing situation. They're living someplace they have to move from, and it's expensive. More recently, a promising new strategy has emerged, which we call rapid rehousing. Rapid rehousing focuses on getting people quickly back into housing by helping them specifically with their housing problems. Credit and tenant issues, as you know, when you get evicted, you have a bad tenant history, or you might have credit issues. Identification of landlords who are willing to rent to them, and affordable units, first and last month's rent for deposits, and short-term rent subsidies, and linkage to services once you get into housing, because people do need services. They just don't need them. They do better with them after housing than before housing. The guiding principle is to get people into housing faster, to shorten how long they're homeless, we call that length of stay, And we can take the money that we spent on them living in a facility and use that to help them move into their own place, provide some subsidy, and then get them services. So many homeless providers around the country have found this rapid rehousing approach kind of counterintuitive, because they feel that these very poor families and individuals really need more help before they're ready to move into housing. But I think that the lesson of rapid rehousing is something that all of us actually do understand intuitively, which is that we do the best, we function best when we have the stability of a place to live, when we have a home. In any case, regardless of my opinion, rapid rehousing seems to work. We continue to get data from community after community on the effectiveness of rapid rehousing. We've compiled some recently from 14 communities where we have worked. There's nothing scientific about that sample, but just to share with you what we found, because every place we look, the statistics may differ slightly, but the framework is the same. Rapid rehousing is more successful than other interventions in getting people into permanent housing, so ending their homelessness. 85% of people in rapid rehousing go to permanent housing, versus only 55% of people from transitional housing and 32% of people from shelter. Fewer people who get rapid rehousing become homeless again. So you get them into housing, you may think, but if they're just going to become homeless again, fall out of it. Only 4% of people who got rapid rehousing returned to homelessness, compared to 9% of those who got transitional housing and 11% of those who got shelter. And rapid rehousing is cost effective. The average cost to end someone's homelessness using rapid rehousing is $4,000 per episode, compared to $10,000 for shelter and $22,000 for transitional housing. So rapid rehousing works better and it costs less. So what's the solution to homelessness for economically homeless people, that 80% of the population? Well, ultimately, the solution is adequate incomes and an adequate supply of affordable housing so that they don't become homeless in the first place. But until we achieve these, we can help the vast majority of people move quickly back into housing with short-term rent subsidies and connection to services in the community. This is better for them, it's a better investment of public and private resources, and it brings down the number of homeless people. Where has it worked? We're working with the state of Virginia, the whole state, to transform its family homelessness system to a rapid rehousing approach, We the Alliance. The state has retooled its funding, and we, the Alliance, has trained every jurisdiction in the state on rapid rehousing. Family homelessness went down, this is a family system orientation, family homelessness went down 10% in the first year of this initiative. The state recently completed a rapid rehousing challenge, which housed 540 families in 100 days, which was 70% of the families that were homeless at that point this winter. Memphis, Tennessee reduced family homelessness 30% between 2012 and 2014. They eliminated 46% of their transitional housing and shifted the resources to rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing for the highest need families. There are a few of those. And it's not just families. A study of 9,000 individuals who received rapid rehousing in Georgia found that people who received shelter and transitional housing were 4 to 5 times more likely to become homeless again than people who received rapid rehousing. So this is obviously something that works, and I know it's being done very extensively here in Portland, so that's an exciting development. Rapid rehousing can reduce the length of homelessness, it can reduce returns to homelessness, and it can reduce the number of homeless people significantly. What about the chronically homeless, disabled group of people, the people we see on our streets and our shelters who are going to need more than rapid rehousing can provide? Well, traditionally, our response for this group has been shelter. But shelter does not work very well for them, and they can't escape homelessness with the minimal amount of help and services that are available to them in most shelters. Plus, as we saw with the economic group, it turns out that services delivered in the context of shelter or lack of stable housing do not work very well. It's not really reasonable, I think, to expect that people who are disabled, that have mental illness or chronic substance abuse disorders, are going to get clean and sober and compliant with services while they're basically living on the street or moving in and out of shelter. They tend to end up staying homeless for longer and longer periods, and they become chronically homeless. Fortunately, in the mid to late 1990s, a group of social innovators developed a type of housing that seemed to work to end homelessness for this group of people. Permanent supportive housing, subsidized housing enriched with services that were focused not only on treatment, but also on helping people stay housed, ended homelessness for even the most disabled, persistently homeless people. And research over the years has confirmed that permanent supportive housing is effective for a minimum of 80% and typically well over 95% of people at houses. Further, permanent supportive housing turns out to be also cost-effective. A study in New York City of 4,000 homeless people with serious mental illness showed that it cost public systems, so us, the taxpayer, about $40,000 to leave someone homeless and about the same amount to provide them with permanent supportive housing. Subsequent rigorous studies on people with HIV/AIDS and chronic street inebriates have confirmed these cost savings findings. So based on this information, the National Alliance to End Homelessness and others began successfully to ask for federal funds to provide permanent supportive housing for chronically homeless people. And as of last year, there were nearly 300,000 units of that nationally. This is also something that's been done extensively here. Providing people with chronic disabilities with permanent supportive housing works to reduce the number of homeless people. I mentioned Memphis on the family side. They also reduced chronic homelessness 39% between 2012 and 2014 by increasing their supply of permanent supportive housing by 44%. Worcester, Massachusetts reduced the number of chronically homeless people from 200 to 2 and closed its shelter. It basically took the approach that no one needed shelter. Rather, when people showed up for shelter, it either diverted or rapidly rehoused those who had lower needs and created enough permanent supportive housing units to house the people who had higher needs, skipping the shelter step. Salt Lake City, Utah, and Phoenix both ended chronic homelessness among veterans last month after a friendly rivalry to see who could be first. They both set a manageable goal, reorganized resources behind it. Both are extending the work from veterans to the chronic population more generally. And New Orleans housed 2 chronically homeless people a day for months and over 900 in a year. So we have 2 major populations of homeless people, people who are economically homeless, including families, for whom rapid rehousing is an effective and cost-effective solution. And we have people with disabilities, for whom permanent supportive housing is an effective and cost-effective solution. What do these 2 strategies have in common? They both focus on the exit, on how to get out of homelessness. We really have to pay more attention to figuring out how to end people's homelessness rapidly. If you want to end homelessness, is this all we need to do, rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing? These are the key program approaches to solving homelessness. They're necessary to ending homelessness, but they are not sufficient to reduce the number of homeless people in a city. We've learned that there's some other pieces to that puzzle. On the front end, we have to look at prevention. We could get everybody homeless. My guess, I don't know how long it would take you to house everybody who is homeless in Portland, but my guess is you could probably actually do that pretty rapidly if you just had to worry about the people who were homeless right now. But others would be becoming homeless at the same time. So we need to strengthen our mainstream support systems, such as welfare, employment, mental health, substance abuse treatment, and corrections discharge, foster care, so that they support people and don't discharge them into homelessness, so that they're not dumping people into the homeless system. That's one thing, prevention. Also, we have to move to having a homeless system, not just a collection of individual programs, no matter how fantastic these programs are. And I know that you have really terrific programs here in Portland and in the county. To use, I'm a new baseball fan, so to use a sports analogy, it may be like you have a baseball team that's full of brilliant players that's each maximizing their own individual performance and doing their best to win the game by themselves. But you need a manager to create a strategy and make the tough decisions about how to really achieve the goal of winning. There has to be a team. And it's the same with homelessness. We need a clear, achievable goal around reducing the number of people who are homeless, not just building a system that manages homelessness, but that's focused on bringing those numbers down. And we need someone who is pulling those brilliant players together into a team that can drive toward that goal, making the tough decisions about how to scale up, because a lot of this is not to just do a little bit of what we're doing that's smart, but to do enough of it for everybody. So how to make, then that takes tough decisions, how to make those decisions about scaling up, how much of what is needed, and where we need to shift resources from one strategy or one provider to another, and making those difficult decisions based on shared data and actual information, not just on opinions. So prevention we need to look at, and creating a system with leadership we need to look at. Also, we need to reimagine our crisis systems, our shelters. Far from abandoning shelters, I think we need to make shelters a whole lot better. If homelessness is going to be shorter, shelter is where the action is going to be. The door to the shelter has to be wide open. If we're going to get everyone out of homelessness, we have to get everyone has to be able to get into shelter, to access shelter, so that we can rehouse them. But shelter should not be a place to stay. Rather, it should be a doorway out of homelessness, an exit strategy. If we had shelters that could actually provide people with crisis services, that had tools for diversion, mediation with landlords or family members, so that those people who had some place to go back to were helped to do that, rapid rehousing, service linkage, homeless episodes could be extremely brief. They should also have access to permanent supportive housing units for people with disabilities, so that those people who are not going to be able to exit shelter with less can get those. If length of stay in shelter is shorter, you need fewer beds, and you can keep plowing those resources back into rehousing people. If you build more shelters, you have fewer resources for real help to people. The length of stay starts getting longer, and you're on a downward spiral of just needing more and more shelter beds. So I think we really have to reconceptualize our shelter systems. So places that have been successful in reducing homelessness have key evidence-based interventions that are proven to reduce the length of time that people are homeless and to end homelessness, interventions like rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, and housing first also, so that they're low barrier. People aren't expected to fix all their problems before they enter. We can address that after. A crisis system that is empowered and enabled to move all people who become homeless rapidly into housing after a short stay. Again, that all has to be low barrier. Everybody has to be able to get in and get that help. A community that has strong leadership and an ability to drive towards shared goals and of reducing the number, and that assesses and measures its progress along the way based on data. And mainstream systems that provide a real safety net, that catch people when they start to fall and bounce them back into housing, rather than letting them fall through the holes into the safety net or into homelessness. So this is work that's going on around the country, trying to make these changes. What has the impact of these kind of changes in strategy been? Remembering, we just went through a recession and then cuts in federal budget, so it's been a rough few years on the homelessness front and for poor people. Nationally, between 2012 and 2013, homelessness went down 4% because of these strategies. Unsheltered homelessness went down 12%. Family homelessness went down 7%. Individual homelessness went down 2%. Chronic homelessness went down 7%, veteran homelessness went down 8%. Can you end homelessness here in Portland? In my estimation, you definitely can. Number one, you have extraordinary capacity in your homeless assistance providers here in Portland. Groups like Central City Concern, Join, Volunteers of America on Domestic Violence Front, and many others, and I met several new ones yesterday. these are national models. We use many of these programs to tell other communities what they should do on the program level. A lot of the knowledge about what to do is coming from Portland. So you have terrific capacity in your nonprofit providers. You have the players on the team. I think that's for sure. You also have an incredible collaborative spirit of working together that leverages a lot more out of these programs than they might normally get, so it increases their impact. Perhaps what remains, and I'm not an expert on Portland, so but perhaps what remains is scaling these up and getting them into a tight system that's outcome-focused and data-driven and can assess what new resources are needed and where resources could be shifted to address those things. Jeffrey Sachs, the Columbia University economist and international poverty expert, has said, "It's not that we don't know what to do to end poverty, it's that we don't do enough of it and we don't do it long enough." And I think that pretty much is the story also of our work on homelessness. We do know what to do now, and you know what to do in Portland, but we don't do enough of it, we don't go to scale, and we don't do it long enough, and it takes a long time to build up these systems to capacity. And I would add that unless we get unlimited resources, we also need a tight, goal-oriented and data-driven system that's going to drive the numbers down. We're not doing it efficiently enough either. We can be more efficient. Homelessness is really a heartbreaking problem. And in part, it's heartbreaking because, to me anyway, because it's so unnecessary. We have some big problems in our nation that cause homelessness. There's no question about that. 7 million too few affordable housing units, lack of mental health care, incomes that are too low to meet people's basic needs, substance abuse treatment that's only available for half the people who want it, insufficient health care. If we solved all these problems, we would not have homelessness, that's for sure. But those solutions don't appear to me to be right around the corner. And in the meantime, poor and disabled people in Portland and around the country are coping with those problems right now. Mostly, they're succeeding in coping with them, at least with respect to homelessness, because remember, there are 50 million people who are poor, but only 600,000 become homeless. So most people are coping with that. But still, sometimes things don't work out, and they do become homeless. So we need to devote ourselves to the big fix, to those bigger problems, definitely. We need to spend time working on those. But while we're doing that, when someone has a housing crisis, when someone with mental illness or substance abuse disorders ends up on the street, I just think that it's not beyond us to have a system that quickly helps resolve that crisis, returns them to housing, and connects them with the services that they need in the community. Poor and disabled people are struggling with these problems, and the least I think that we can do is to help them. You definitely have the capacity to do that here in Portland. You have the knowledge, you may have many of the resources, and you may need some strategically more. The question is really whether you have the public and the political will to do enough of it and to do it long enough. So that's my challenge to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And now, if you have a written question on an index card, please hold it high so City Club staff can collect it from you. We'll now take questions from the floor. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their question. Asking questions at the Friday Forum is a benefit of City Club membership. Today, we also welcome our partners from the Citizen Crime Commission, Street Roots, and the Oregon Opportunity Network to the microphone. Before asking your question, identify yourself. Please ask only one question and ask it as succinctly as possible.
My name is Richard Elmeyer, City Club member. Homelessness is basically a public housing policy issue. In the city of Portland, our policy here is targeted, unlimited neighborhood concentration of public housing. which we achieve by denying the public access to accurate, complete, and timely public housing statistical data, which of course includes the homeless. Have you found in your travels throughout the country that other cities commonly adopt this public housing policy?
You know, I really couldn't understand, I'm sorry, but the mic was reverbing and I couldn't quite understand what the policy was. I got it was around public housing that you wanted. Sorry. Did you get it?
Now?
Yeah.
We have a, how are we doing? Okay. The policy is targeted, unlimited neighborhood concentration of public housing, which includes the homeless, which is the policy not only for the city of Portland, but also for Multnomah County. And much of what you have talked about relates to public housing policy issues and making sure that the elected officials at whatever level are sensitive to the kinds of suggestions that you're making, not the least of which is a concern for the location of where whatever kind of housing you're suggesting in whatever program, where that might be placed, in what neighborhood, and to what extent the percentage of homeless or public housing would be, is a huge, huge issue. And the city has chosen to not allow the data for that to be publicly accessible, so we don't have to actually talk about that. And while I'm totally in sympathy with your points, I'm just curious whether other cities have a similar view.
Well, I would say, first of all, you know, public and assisted housing generally has taken quite a big hit in the budget. I can't speak to the location issues or the targeting. It's a local, jurisdictional decision how people want to allocate public and assisted housing and what priority populations they want to serve with that housing. Certainly, public and assisted housing is a key element of ending homelessness, but it's not the only piece. There are a lot of other ways to help people with housing besides just Section 8 and public housing, although having more of them would definitely help.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. My question is, how did we get to this point? To elaborate just a bit, when I was a welfare intake worker in the 50s, I once had a man come in and say he'd been living under a bridge, and I was shocked. And when I talked about it in the coffee room at break time, all my fellow caseworkers were shocked. There was no such thing as someone living under a bridge at that time. Today is common. What happened?
Yes, that's right. As I said, really, as early ago as the 70s, we really didn't have it. What happened is we lost a lot of affordable housing stock. We lost, there used to be 2 million single-room occupancy units in the country, for example. Now they're just a handful. That alone explains a big chunk of homelessness. And through condo and co-op conversion, through urban renewal, we just lost a lot of supply of affordable housing and didn't replace it. And the result, I think that's largely the driver in homelessness, this mismatch between the number of people who need affordable housing and the number of units we have. We're net losing, I think, 200,000 units of affordable housing a year. We're not really addressing this gap at all. We're going the wrong direction.
Chris Andre, City Club member. It's what you're talking about and proposing. It makes absolutely unassailable sense. The person before me was talking about bridges, people living under bridges, which is like, you know, the George Orwell quote from Down and Out in Paris and London. But in a society where the law prevents the rich and poor alike from sleeping under bridges, the law here that we are confronted with in many ways strips people who do not have housing of their dignity and their self-determination. in that they are objects which need to be housed or put somewhere out of the public view. And I think that's an obstacle to getting people safe, which is the more important goal, it would seem. How do you plan to take it? How do these programs take into account the acknowledgement of people's essential dignity and humanity?
So it is very important to take into account people's sexual identity and their culture in giving people choice. And I think these housing interventions that we're talking about, rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, are very very consumer-oriented interventions. They're really about giving people choice and trying to get them into a safer situation and linked with services. Certainly much safer than leaving people homeless, which is an extremely unsafe situation for people to be in.
Edward Hershey, City Club member. One other change between the 1970s and the 1980s forward was the massive deinstitutionalization of people in secure psychiatric care. That was undertaken in the unfulfilled promise and false premise that there would be many community-based facilities to replace those secure beds. Obviously, that hasn't happened. How many of the people who are now homeless are victims of that gap, and what can be done about it? And is that effort competing with funds for affordable housing?
So deinstitutionalization started in the 60s, and it definitely is a factor in the emergence of homelessness, although I would say that for a long time a lot of people with mental illness were getting housed because they could afford housing. People with mental illness also have disproportionately low incomes. The permanent supportive housing that I discussed, particularly Housing First, where you get people into housing very rapidly, can be a mental health intervention. There are evidence-based practices around doing that, where you can provide people with mental health services while they're in housing. So it's in effect trying to create those community systems of care that can support people who have mental illness in housing.
Jean DeMaster, Human Solutions, City Club member. My comment is first to say that we in Multnomah County, Human Solutions, have been using the Housing First model for at least the last 4 to 5 years and get the same results or slightly better than you have pointed out. But my question is, we know on the one-night shelter counts, on the recent one, there about 9,200 people were homeless on that one night that we did the count. Half of them were singles, half of them were people in families. But my question has to do with the people in, if you look at the data more specifically, about 20 to 25% of the people who are homeless on any night are children under the age of 17. They're not homeless youth living alone, they're children under the age of 17. What recommendations do you have that those children don't grow up to be homeless adults?
So they're children living in families. Yes. So, I mean, I think the best thing to do to help children living in families is to get the families back into housing fast. There's children, there are a lot of bad effects of homelessness on children, but children are very resilient and they recover from those bad effects very rapidly. So the thing really is to just shorten, as short as we can, the length of time they spend homeless. Get them back into housing so they've got a stable neighborhood, they can go to school, and their lives are not disrupted.
I'd like to ask a question from one of the index cards. How to respond to the comment that most or many homeless people don't want to be sheltered or placed in homes by others?
It's not been my experience that most homeless people don't want to be housed. Sometimes they don't want to go to places that have a lot of rules that they're not interested in complying with. But if you have a Housing First, if you want to get everybody in, you have to have a low threshold to the front door to get them in. And I think it sometimes takes a long time and some persuasion, especially with people with mental illness. But I think at the end of the day, pretty much everybody wants a home. And if they can find their path forward to it, they'll take it. So I think it's really more how we present things often that creates the barriers than that people don't want it.
Kurt Roybring, member. Clearly it's a resource problem, and you lightly mentioned HUD, but my understanding is that HUD just doesn't have very much money for affordable housing anymore. To what degree have cities and states stepped up and starting putting resources in affordable housing? I know that New York and other East Coast states in the past had done that with special subsidized programs, and wondering what the current experience is.
Well, it's true that the housing budget nationally has not fared very well, and I think there's also, notwithstanding this sort of major gap in affordable housing nationally, there's not a lot of political or public will to do anything about it. So you're correct about that. There definitely, certainly are cities and states that have stepped up on affordable housing generally. A lot of places have trust funds or other kind of dedicated revenue sources that go into affordable housing. And also, I think on the homelessness side, which I know better, really looking at homelessness, the size of the population in a jurisdiction or a state, the number of people that need assistance, that has driven a lot of political will of housing, toward housing resources also. And, homelessness isn't the whole poverty population, obviously, but getting everybody who's homeless into housing would make a little dent, at least, in the poverty population.
My name is Israel Bayer with Street Roots. I have two questions. One question is, can you give us some specific examples of how communities have created additional revenue for affordable housing and homeless services, kind of piggybacking, but is there some specific examples? And then to talk about how can both traditional and non-traditional partners work together. Historically, the business community and advocates and the social service providers in the cities have been at these crossroads trying to figure this out, and a few examples of where those communities have worked together to better the problem.
Okay. So specific revenue sources around homelessness. In Miami-Dade, there's a restaurant tax that goes to homeless services. In Fort Lauderdale, there's a 1 cent per gallon gasoline tax that goes to homelessness and domestic violence services. There are a lot of places where there's a real estate transfer tax. The district is one that go into housing subsidies. So I think real estate related taxes or payments are a common, I think, way to tap resources into homeless assistance. And the other thing you were asking about was partnerships between different sectors that have worked citywide. Well, I think getting the business community involved is often very key. Business has typically, and I have heard some of this here in Portland, has a kind of vested interest in solving homelessness. Business people typically don't want people living on the streets. Not good for business, not good for tourism. Police are another, I met this morning with some of your people from the police department here in Portland. I mentioned to them a police chief that had told me previously that the only people that are on the street 24 hours a day, 7 days a week are the homeless people and the police. But the police are not really resourced to deal with homelessness. So they're also a group, I think, that has a lot of interest in seeing the problem solved. And obviously, when you bring these groups together, people that are concerned about safety, and I know that's a big issue here, corrections, the faith community also very involved in this, the business community, along with the providers in the public sector. This is obviously the most powerful alliance, and probably the city, I would say, that's doing best in terms of efficiency on homelessness, Columbus, Ohio. They run their system using a coalition like that.
We have time for one final question.
Carol Witherell, City Club member. Thank you for coming. Can you say more about the effects of the school-to-prison pipeline caused by many more exclusionary disciplinary practices and also those in reentry from the prison system. What are the impacts on homelessness and what's being done? And thanks for your work.
Well, a very vexing difficulty in the homelessness system is rehousing people who are exiting from jails and prisons. Again, I don't know the situation here, but in a lot of communities there are tremendously punitive practices against people in terms of employment and housing, where they can be housed depending on their crime. And of course, people are incarcerated, people of color are disproportionately incarcerated, and this is compounding all of the issues. Again, I feel like these rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing solutions are really a way to address these problems equitably and effectively and take on these difficult challenges by giving people a little extra help to get back into housing and serving as an intermediary with landlords and so forth. So they can help, I think, with those problems.
Unfortunately, we've run out of broadcast time for further questions and we'll have to stop for the day. Join us next week for the state of the regional economy. And as we close for today, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to Nan Roman, Citizens Crime Commission, Street Roots, and the Oregon Opportunity Network. We are adjourned.